So, in our last PowerPoint, we described the fact that your heart muscles are categorized to two different types. One type are called non-contractile cells or pacemaker cells, and these cells were responsible for creating electrical impulses within the heart. And the second type of cells were called the contractile cells, which are still considered to be excitable cells, and they are responsible for creating contractile force inside the heart, which basically causes the heart to create its pumping action. We also got familiar with vocabulary such as depolarization, repolarization, threshold, as well as action potential. So depolarization was identified as making your cell more positive or less negative by gaining positive charge. When you repolarized it, it basically implied that you have lost positive charge, and if your cell is basically not undergoing any changes such as depolarization, repolarization, it is resting, so we refer to that as resting membrane potential, which is typically around -70 with a little bit higher or lower depending on the cell type. And that resting membrane potential was maintained using your sodium leakage channels, moving sodium in, using your potassium leakage channel, moving potassium out, and your sodium potassium ATPase that move 3 sodium out and 2 potassium in at a given time. So let's move on to discussing the electrical impulses of the heart. First thing you need to understand is that the heart needs to undergo depolarization, and that depolarization can lead to a stimulation of the contractile cells of the heart, leading to muscle contraction. So if I was describing a 3-step process that leads to muscle contraction, the way I like to write it is the following. You have action potential, or basically electrical impulses, that are created within your pacemaker cells. That is leading to action and potential that is created in your contractile cells, and that eventually leads to muscle contraction of your, logically, your contractile cells. Cells, not an E. So let's take a look at this concept. Then pacemaker cells of your body are strategically located throughout your heart, and they are connected with themselves as well as your contractile cells using your specific junction called gap junction, utilized for cell-to-cell communication. And clearly I can spell and talk at the same time. Now, this pathway of non-contractile cells that are spread throughout the cell create a system called intrinsic cardiac conduction system, or simply intrinsic conduction system, which is again network of your non-contractile cells that allows the electrical impulses that are created to be spread out throughout the heart, and that eventually leads to depolarization of the whole heart and eventual muscle contraction. So let's take a look at your electrical impulses and the action potential created by your pacemaker cells. Now, the action potential that is generated by your pacemaker cells, action potential initiated by your pacemaker cells, which are also called non-contractile cells, are also called pacemaker potential. Okay? Now, there is a significant difference between what is the action potential created by your non-contractile cells versus the typical description that I've discussed with you earlier. So let me just describe what a typical cell will have. This is a repeat of what I discussed with you earlier. So what you will have normally in a cell that is excitable, you have resting, depolarization, repolarization, back to resting. So we draw this last time. You have rest, going up, depolarization, repolarization, and reestablishing again resting potential. This is a normal cell that is basically looking for an excitation source somewhere. It gets stimulated. So from rest, it depolarizes, repolarizes, and then it goes back to resting. However, recall that your heart doesn't have anything that creates the stimulus, right? Your non-contractile cells are themselves are the one that creates their excitation. They are acting as their own stimulus. They are the source of a stimulus. So I cannot rely on, or I cannot maintain a resting, because if they're resting, remember, no resting means no action potential. No action potential in your non-contractile cells means no action potential in your contractile cells, and that means no muscle contraction. If your heart is not contracting, you're dead, right? So what you need to do is you never should allow your non-contractile cells to have a resting phase. Resting is out for your non-contractile cells. It is okay for your contractile cells, just not okay for your non-contractile cells. So what is your non-contractile cells have instead of resting membrane potential? What they have is a specific potential called pacemaker potential. So in a process that causes basically the intrinsic conduction system, that is the electrical impulses created in your non-contractile cells, we have a 3-step process. So I'm going to draw this for you, and then I'll show you on the PowerPoint as well to kind of familiarize you with the information. So I'm going to start with the drawing of a cell and show you the 3 ions that are extremely important for creating action potential or pacemaker potential within a non-contractile cells. The 3 ions are sodium, which is high outside the cell, calcium, which is also high outside the cell, and potassium, which is high inside the cell. So these 3 ions are going to be essential for creating my action potential within non-contractile cells. So let's graph this, guys. Sorry, it's not the most straight line, but let's graph this. So in the non-contractile cells, what we start with is negative 60. And this negative 60 millivolt is, again, we don't have a straight line. We don't have resting. What I will have is a continuous depolarization. So this is depolarization, and it is done by having a specific type of channels called sodium VGC. Now, if you guys recall from your channels, we had a specific type of channels called voltage gated channels, which I shorthand to VGC. There are 3 different types of them. You have sodium VGC, which when they are open causes the sodium to come in, and I'm going to use the word influx. We have potassium VGC. Sorry about the sirens if you guys can hear it. We have potassium VGCs, which causes the potassium to go out of the cell, which I use the word efflux. And the last type of channels are calcium VGCs, which again, if you remember, calcium is high outside. So if these channels are going to open up, it causes the calcium to influx as well. So remember that these channels are going to open and close at a very specific, I don't know why this is not working, at a very specific voltage. Open or close in a very specific voltage. So at negative 660, what you have is your sodium VGCs are gonna open up. So these are gonna open. And what that leads is sodium coming in. Now, when it reaches a magic number, and magic number in this case is negative 40 millivolts, and this is identified as your threshold. What you're going to open at that threshold is your calcium, what type of channels, guys? VGC. And when they open up, they're going to cause what? Calcium to come where? In or out? Calcium to come inside the cell. Exactly. Now, calcium coming inside the cell means you're gaining a lot of positive charge into the cell, and that causes what? That causes the cell to depolarize. Now, while this is happening, you're also going to close up your sodium channels are going to close. And this is gonna reach the voltage about 0 millivolt. 0 millivolt. Now at 0 millivolt, what you're going to do is you're gonna start to repolarize. So you start to come down back to negative 60. This process is called what? Repolarization. And it is done by the following. Your calcium VGC are going to close. And what you're going to open is your potassium VGCs are going to open. And if potassium opens, potassium is going to do what? Move out. And as they move out, potassium is positive charge, so you're losing the positive charge, and that causes the repolarization. So by the time you're back to the negative 60, you're gonna do what? You're gonna start to depolarize again, which is identical to here, which means your sodium VGCs are gonna open, allowing sodium to come in. But also, what also is going to happen is that your potassium VGCs are going to close. Because I don't want more potassium to get out, because if they do get out, what happens? You're basically gaining positive charge and losing positive charge, so there wouldn't be any change in your potential. So, this being said, and I know it's like I've drawn as a first grader, so let's take a look at what the graph looks like. What I just described to you guys, by the way, it is already on this slide, so I'm not going to redo this again, but information is already in for you. But if I'm going to draw this in a sense of your graph, going from negative 60 to negative 40, which is right here, this is a step 1. This is a step 1. Going from negative 40 all the way to 0 is a step 2. And going from 0 back to the negative 60 is a step 3. Reviewing it one more time. During a step 1, sodium VGCs are gonna open. Sodium is high outside, so sodium is going to come in. So look at this picture again, the three main ions. Sodium is high outside, calcium is high outside, and potassium is high inside. So going from negative, going through the pacemaker potential, potassium channels are, we'll talk about in just a minute, but sodium channels are going to open up and sodium is going to come in. When they come in, it causes the charge to go from negative 60 to negative 40, which is your threshold. At negative 40, what you're going to do is you're going to open up your calcium channels. So now calcium is going to rush in a lot. So it's more significant. Calcium rushes in. And as calcium comes in, you go from negative 40 to 0. And while calcium is coming in, you also stop sodium from coming in. So sodium is not going to be really as essential anymore. And at 0, what you're doing is you're going to push potassium out, which causes the cell to go from 0 to negative 60, causing the cell to repolarize. Again, when your cell is repolarizing, you're allowing potassium to leave the cell, but you also want to prevent calcium to come in, so your calcium channels are going to close. Your potassium channels are going to open, causing the potassium to leave, which means you're losing positive charge, and that causes the cell to become negative, and that is the step we refer to it as repolarization. When you're done with repolarization and you want to create your pacemaker potential again, you open up your channels of the sodium as low sodium channels, but at the same time, you don't want the cell to continue repolarizing, so you close up your potassium channels. And this step repeats itself over and over again. Here again, I'm going to go over the picture because I really want you guys to feel comfortable with that. Try to repeat it with me as I go over this. This step is called the pacemaker potential. It relies on sodium channels opening up, causing sodium to come into the cell. It causes the change of the charge from negative 60 to negative 40. And that change means that your cell has reached the threshold. Threshold is negative 40. At negative 40, you're going to open up your calcium channels, and calcium is going to come into the cell or influx, causing the cell gaining positive and in another sense depolarizing your cell. This is the first step of the action potential. When it reaches around 0, your calcium VGCs are going to close up and you're going to open up your potassium channels. Potassium is going to leave the cell and cause the cell to become negative, so you repolarize the cell. Again, potassium leaving the cell implies that your cell is repolarizing, so at the same time you will be closing up your calcium channels, so no more calcium comes into the cell. One last concept to talk about. What I described to you as the action potential of the pacemaker cells, or your pacemaker potential of the non-contractile cells. These are cells, as I mentioned, are strategically located throughout the heart to make sure that the electrical impulses are spread throughout the heart. And these cells, these non-contractile cells, are found in the following structure. They are found, one of them that initiates this whole process is located, it's known as cyanoatrial or SA node. The second one is called atrioventricular or AV node. Next one is called atrioventricular bundle, which branches off to the right and left bundle branches. And that branches into Purkinje fiber, which are the smallest categories or branching of the non-contractile cells. to pass these electrical impulses from the SA node all the way to Purkinje fiber, it takes about 0.22 seconds to travel the electrical impulses to spread the electrical impulses from the SA node to the Purkinje fiber. So we'll pick up these concepts and where each of these structures are located within the heart and how they actually use the gap junction to spread the electrical impulses. We'll discuss this in the next PowerPoint.